I'm LJ. I'm an admissions officer here at Rhode Island School of Design. I'm currently on campus in Providence, where we're sort of covered in snow and a little bit of a winter wonderland, depending on if you like the snow or not. And I'll pass it over to my colleagues here to introduce themselves. I'll pass over to Marin. Oh, and I should say that I'm going to be here kind of hosting and moderating. We'll be here to kind of talk about our first year in Florence program, how it kind of went this last fall, where we had our first cohort kind of experience their semester there. I should say, well, aren't going to get into like some of the more logistical things like housing or financial aid or visa things. We have webinars where we'll be kind of covering those things later on as it sort of gets into that kind of nitty-gritty season, if you will. So with that, I'll pass it over to Marin to introduce herself.
Thanks, LJ. Hi, everyone. My name is Marin Brennan. I also work in admissions, and I'm going to be excitedly learning more about Florence right along with you, but I'm also going to be acting as chat manager, so fielding questions while Matteo presents. So I definitely encourage you to pay attention to this presentation because it's awesome. I've seen it. It's great. So definitely enjoy. But if you have any and all questions, please feel free to enter them, but in the Q&A chat box, not the chat box where you told us where you're tuning in from, just so we can drop links in there. And we also don't want your questions to get buried. So we'll have time to reappear and field those questions, as LJ said, after Mateo's presentation. And then I'm going to pass it to you, Mateo.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Matteo. I am from Florence, Italy, and I just graduated from RISD. I was an illustration major and I used to work at admissions. And I was lucky enough that when I graduated from RISD, RISD was just starting this Florence program, almost seemed like they were doing it just for me. And I've been lucky enough to get to work with sort of the last, this first cohort of students. And yeah, I'm excited to sort of share a little bit about it with you guys. So here's a little overview of what we're going to cover. We'll talk a little bit about how the program works. We'll talk about the location, so where in Florence it is, and the curriculum. And we'll talk very briefly about the housing and resources. We'll sort of just like touch on it. And then, sort of specifics will be covered, in other presentations. So firstly, what is this program? So our Florence program is modeled after our first year curriculum. So you'll be essentially taking, the same class you take in your first year at RISD, your studio classes, and I'll cover a little bit more, in depth, what those classes are, and you'll be joined by faculty from RISD. So it's almost, a study abroad for the students, but also a study abroad for the professors. And there's a fall and a spring semester. You might know that RISD has sort of like a mini semester in between called winter session. Um, Thus far, we're not doing that yet in Florence, so now it's just the fall or the spring. And then each semester where we have a cohort of 20 people, which is essentially the size of a typical section at RISD in your freshman year. And so when you get accepted to the program, you get accepted to one of the semesters, so fall or the spring, and you can see the dates on here. So normally at RISD on the main campus, you take all three studios at the same time. Instead, in Florence, you take one studio at a time, and you have each studio for 1 month. So, this past semester we had drawing, then we had design, and then we had spatial. And then on top of that, you'll be taking some liberal arts classes that you would also take at RISD. Those can sometimes be online, or this past semester is with a local professor, an Italian professor. So you're learning about art history in Florence with an Italian art history professor. And then a great part about the course that you have is additional travel opportunities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But sort of a little sneak peek is that with each course, you get to sort of go on one big trip with your class on top of all the other sort of museum visits that you get to do when you're in Florence. And then on top of that, we also offer lots of like ways to get engaged in the local community. So like internships and, events in Florence. And we really try to get people involved in Florence so that you're not just essentially like, a tourist for 3 months, but that you're really like living here and like, meeting people and being involved in the local community. So experimental and foundation studies. So that is our fancy way of calling our first year program. You'll also probably hear me call it EFS. So when you hear me say EFS, that is just another way to refer to RISD's first year program. And so as I've said, we're sort of The bulk of, or like the main part of EFS is you take these three required studios, drawing, design, and spatial. And so I'm going to show some examples of student work from this past semester in Florence. So this is work from some of our amazing students from our drawing class. So generally drawing is, well, you're drawing with charcoal, drawing with pencil, doing still lives and figure models. Then, you sort of branch off a little bit. So we have some examples where works here are done in color. And this faculty also really made it very specific to Florence. So we saw some sort of, this was their first exploration of Florence, both, visiting and also like artistically. Then we had design. So design is sort of where you start to venture off and like explore ideas a little bit more, let's say, creatively, sort of in a way that's more akin to like, graphic design or illustration perhaps. And so we'd like to see some more like, paintings, or for example, this was done on a tablecloth, or we have another piece that was done like this red one with tape, and then the student, ran their fingers down the tape to make these like shapes. So you sort of get to branch off a little bit more. And then we have spatial dynamics, which is essentially a class where you explore all things 3D. And this past semester in Florence, we were joined by Rochelle Rosenkrantz, who is a guitar maker. And so each student had to make their own instrument, like their own proposal for an instrument, and then we sat down with them and we helped them figure out how in 1 month we can make their instruments come to life. And it was very, very cool, and it was very, very fun for everyone involved. So, location. So sort of what we have here is a zoomed in picture of Florence. I'm not cropping a lot out. So for those who may not know, Florence is not, an insanely big city like Rome or, Milan, for example. The historic center of Florence is only about, I would say, an hour across walking, depending on how fast you walk, obviously. And so here you have some sort of key locations highlighted. So highlighted one is location of our dorms, two is our studio building, and three is the building where you'll have your liberal arts classes. And so they're all very close to each other. And I'll sort of give some, reference points to sort of gauge how far things are from each other. But it's all in the center of Florence. The dorms are walking distance from the Duomo, well, walking distance because it's down the road from the Duomo, which is our main cathedral, Santa Croce, Sant'Ambrogio, and I'll sort of go into some of the things that we're, near. And so this is our studio building. Our studio is called Palazzo dei Cartelloni, which roughly translates to the banner building because of these two big banners that you'll see. And actually, fun fact, this building was built sort of in addition to complexes which were owned by the family that commissioned the Mona Lisa. And so that sort of gives you an idea of how old some of these buildings that we're, gonna have classes in. And this building then later was owned by a student of Galileo who then set this up sort of as like, a monument to him. And in fact, that's his statue in the middle. And this is also very luckily, or we're very lucky to get to call this, our studio. And so it even has this, magnificent courtyard that is, open to RISD students. So definitely like in the nice months is where you'll see a lot of students like have lunch or reading a book, or during the instrument assignments, some instruments had brought their or like rented instruments and were even like practicing in the courtyard. It is very nice. And sort of this is a gallery space that we use for our crits, and it looks very similar to like what our studio spaces look like. So it's these old, beautiful rooms that have then been turned into studio spaces. And one of the rooms as well even has these beautiful like paintings on the ceiling. It's a very, very nice building. And so that's where you'll have your studio classes. Then your liberal arts classes, you'll have them, in a different building in Via Sant'Egidio, which is near sort of one of the oldest hospitals in Italy. And again, that is sort of like the division where you'll have your studio classes in one building and then your liberal arts in this other building, equally historic building, equally beautiful building. It's across the street from a very nice cafe as well. And so, just to give some context again as to where everything is in relation to other monuments in Florence that you may or may not be familiar with. So, again, one, the building highlighted as one is the dorms, two is the studio, and then three is where we have our liberal arts classes. And so, one is the dorms, four is the Duomo, which is our main cathedral. And so, when I said it is down the road from the Duomo, I literally mean it is down the road from the Duomo. And one of the dorms even has a view of the Duomo. And as a local, I have to say I was very, very jealous when I went in to do check-in with the students. I wish I could have been lucky enough to be in the dorms as well. And as you can see, I've also highlighted, things that are a 5 minute walk, things that are a 10-minute walk. And, outside of that, it's really not that far, especially considering how central the dorms are. And so the location five is Uffizi Gallery, which is one of the biggest museums, or it's the biggest in Florence, and it has an incredible collection. So here you'll see some of the works that are housed in the Uffizi, and we've had many trips to see these pieces. So we have, for example, the Birth of Venus, Primavera, this work by Paolo Uccello or Bacchus or Medusa, these works from Caravaggio and Botticelli and Da Vinci and all these really famous artists that you hear about, in your art history class or that, you see online. We've been really lucky that we've been able to go on multiple visits to, see these paintings in real life. And it really is something. Then six is Ponte Vecchio, which is, this old bridge that has this hallway on top of it and these jewelry stores. It's another big monument in Florence. Seven, which you can see on top, is right next to our studio, and it is the Central Market, which is sort of like a food hall. And then on the outside is also a leather market. And again, that is down the street from our studio building. Eight, which is sort of on a slightly different part of town, but about, 5-ish minutes away from the dorms, is the Accademia, where the David lives. Nine is San Lorenzo Church, which is this beautiful, beautiful chapel, which you might recognize from one of the students' paintings earlier. 10 is Santa Maria Novella, which is our train station, our central train station. And I highlight that because something that's really nice about Florence is that we're sort of in, the middle-ish of the country. And so Bologna, for example, is half an hour. Rome is an hour and a half. Milano is under 2 hours. Venice is like 2 hours and a half. And so, these are places you'll go to with class. But if you ever want to do a little weekend escape, it's very easy to go to a lot of places from Florence. We're really strategically located. And 11 is Santa Croce. It's a little bit farther out, but it's sort of next to a neighborhood that is very like, a lot of locals live in that neighborhood. And Santa Croce is sort of where a lot of like Italian, icons are buried. It's also a beautiful church in Florence. And it's about, 10-15 minute walk from the dorms. And yeah, so basically, I just rambled on about some of the famous things that we're surrounded by. And honestly, you could go on and on and on. That's really only like the highlights, but that really is a great asset that we have sort of to use in our classes. And so I'm going to go through and sort of show some pictures of some of the trips that we've gotten to go on with class. So this is us, the guy in the middle is not a student. He's the professor, David Scanavino, who is a design professor. And we went and did a visit in the Uffizi Gallery. This was actually our second visit in the Uffizi Gallery. And, a great thing about studying, working for this program and studying in Florence is that you don't just go to the big famous museums, but for example, here we went to La Specora, which is an anatomical wax museum, which is sort of like a less famous thing in Florence, but still equally amazing and equally cool. And this was a trip that we did. I believe it was for drawing that we went to this museum, and it was definitely like a highlight. And again, I say that because these are places that you don't necessarily always go to when you're on in vacation in Florence for, a few days with your family. You get to really have like a much more, in-depth exploration of the city. And then this is another, this is a place we went to during orientation that I took the students to. It's called Gino Ricci, and it is essentially an artisanal jewelry shop. And it looks like you're entering someone's apartment, and then you go down into this basement, and it is this artisan's gold shop. And actually, you might have seen it possibly on TikTok, but it is worth the visit. And, we had some students definitely, walking away with some nice new jewelry. And then, this is an example of in class. We were joined by, a professor who teaches not at RISD, but a local professor who also does art restoration for, the famous museums in Florence. And he came and he taught us how to do a fresco painting, which is sort of how the famous pieces like Birth of Venus and Primavera, they were made, with this old technique. And we got to do it as well in class. It's very, very fun. I got to do one as well. And so those are some examples of sort of smaller trips that we did. But as I said earlier, we get to go on sort of one bigger trip with each studio class. And so for drawing, they went to Venice and they did an overnight trip to Venice. For design, we went to Milano, and it was actually on my birthday as well. And we went to Milan and we got to see, the Last Supper and the design museum. And then a trip that was, I mean, all the trips were amazing, but this trip really was show-stopping because it was a city that I'd never been to see things that were really, really like particular. and it was our Cremona visit with spatial dynamics. And so, as I said earlier, for spatial dynamics, we were joined by Rochelle Rosenkrantz, who is an instrument maker. And so, this trip was essentially a day immersed in violin making. And so, Cremona is the city where Stradivari, who makes the Stradivarius violins, was born and lived. And he actually only ever left that city once in his life. So, anyone who wanted a Stradivarius violin went to Cremona to talk to him. And so, we started our day going to Casa Stradivari, which is essentially a workshop where, young violin makers go and learn sort of traditional violin and cello making, and then they make a quartet, I believe it's called, and then it gets played by a maestro when they're done, and we got to see, the workshop and get an explanation as to how these instruments are made. Um, and then in the afternoon, we went to the Violin Museum, which is this amazing violin, much bigger than I expected, where we got to see all of these original violins and cellos, which were made by Stradivari himself. And then, the last thing that we got in the day, we were lucky enough that when we were there, we got to hear, a young maestro playing like an actual Stradivari violin. So a violin from, I can't remember what year, but, like old, like hundreds of years old, playing it in real life. And it was really, really something. And this is the auditorium. Unfortunately, I couldn't take pictures during the recording, but this is, the beautiful auditorium that we had it in. And so this trip, we did it sort of in the first weeks of spatial dynamics. And so we really were focused, or it was a way for people to sort of start to learn and get ideas of how to make instruments because I mean, I would assume most people have not made an instrument in high school. I actually had Rochelle as a student, and I know that I never made an instrument before I took her class. And so it was nice to go to Cremona and see sort of the very traditional ways that these instruments were made, and so that the students could really like get inspired, when making their own instruments. So you have some great examples of like violins and a bass and a harp. And it was nice because some students even made, like this student, her violin was made for her brother, or, a student played the cello and made himself a cello. It was very fun. It was a fun class. So, housing and resources. Again, I'm only going to cover this sort of very, very briefly because it'll be covered in sort of later panels and presentations. But again, the dorms are very central, and there's, a myriad of staff that are here to help you with housing, food, health, safety, other logistics. There's a reception with people who help you, should you have any issues. And, all the people that we work with are, you know, very easy to reach, especially when it comes to, housing and, other things that happen sort of in the center of Florence. Um, yeah, and sort of the last bullet point, meals ordered slash prepared by students. So we actually don't have a cafeteria in Florence, which I feel like makes sense. So if you go to Florence, for the most part, you'll be sort of cooking for yourself or, going out to eat in Florence, which, could be worse. So you unfortunately won't have access to the Met, which is the RISD cafeteria, but don't worry, you'll have access to that when you go back. And then I'll touch briefly on what to pack. So obviously, when packing for studying abroad, you obviously want to know the regulations for, the airlines that you're flying. Um, Seasonal changes. So, the students, oh, sorry, thumbs up went up by accident. Um, Clothing depending on the season that you're coming in. And sort of an important thing is appliances. So we have to use a different like voltage and wattage in Italy. So if you, come to Italy, with your hair straightener or your curler or your dryer and go to plug it in without a good transformer, it'll pop. So, sometimes it might be worth honestly buying like a cheap one here while you're here. And then, in the end, we have a little bit of advice from fall 25 students. So, each professor will sort of provide you with a packing list or, like a materials list. And we do provide some materials. There's a lot of art stores sort of in and around the area, like where the dorms and the studios are. But if you have, your favorite materials that you love and you can't live without, then you should definitely, bring it. If we start to go into, sharp tools, then obviously depends on the airline. But if you have your heirloom Mont Blanc pen that you really want to bring, then bring it. Or even if you have like charcoal at the house that you'll be able to use, I would recommend bringing that as well. But then, general supplies like paper, paint, if you don't bring your charcoal, if you don't bring your supplies, all that stuff, you can buy it for the most part in Florence. And then we actually do also provide sort of like a toolkit that has a lot of like basic, like brushes and tools, especially for spatial dynamics that you'll end up using, you know, in the course. And another quick thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that we actually have a small wood shop in our building in Florence, which is definitely like a great thing to have. And so we have a bandsaw, drill press, a chop saw or miter saw, some people call it different things. So we have some of that, but when you're at Razer, you'll have access also to like laser cutters, CNC machine. Instead in Florence, our theme was definitely a little bit more, handmade, a little bit more artisanal. But that just made it all the more fun. But again, if you have specific things that you like to use, then you probably should bring it. And then, bring the clothes you like, bring the clothes you need. If you know you're gonna, buy things and go shopping in Florence or Milan, then, maybe leave a little extra space in your suitcase. Okay. And so I'm gonna end on this picture, which is a little group picture. And I've talked about the instruments a lot just because I was really amazed with again, also being a student that took that class, and when I was at RISD on the main campus, the instruments I made did not look like that. But these students managed to take, everything that we gave them in Florence and make these incredible instruments. And this was our picture from the last day of class. Um, and yes, that's sort of what I'll end on. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A, not the chat. Don't use the chat, use the Q&A. And yeah, we'll sort of go through and talk about some of your questions. Let's see if I can go on the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. It was so
Yeah,
nice
of
to
course.
learn about what you guys kind of were up to this fall.
Mhm.
There were a couple that I kind of just want to sort of address first that we saw a few come up. And those I'll just sort of say, it was asked when people apply to this. You apply to this when you apply to RISD, so it's not something that you're working through in your first year. You're applying to it again in the application process to RISD. And all students, when they reach RISD, are going through our EFS year, as Mateo was kind of just outlining. So there's no sort of major specific classes. So all of these courses are available to you. Again, you're not applying to RISD with a specific major. So, this Florence program is available to anyone applying to RISD as long as they're sort of selecting their interest there. But one thing that came up, which I don't know, might be interesting to address is there like a level of Italian, proficiency needed in order to go
Mm.
into this program, or how did you find that students navigated sort of speaking or learning the language, even off campus or something like that
Yeah.
during their
So,
their fall
yeah, it's a
semester?
great question. So, actually, I should have mentioned earlier, you do take sort of a beginner Italian class when you're here. Should have put that earlier, but yeah, you take a beginner Italian class when you're here. It's not the entire semester. It's sort of like at the beginning, and you learn some of the fundamentals. But Florence is not like a huge city, like I said, but we are definitely used to tourism. So if you don't speak Italian, that is totally okay. Like most people here do speak English now, especially like in the center where the dorms are. And all of our staff speaks English. Professors are from Maisie, so they'll be speaking English. And so I think, yeah, none of the students that came last semester spoke any Italian, and they were a-okay. Some learned a little bit of Italian at the end. And when I'm there, I definitely try to, get people to learn some things. I'm not gonna have my RISD students walking around calling things the wrong name or saying things with the wrong way. So I correct people when I hear wrong things, and I try to, get a little bit of Italian in there. But yeah, so there's no like requirement for speaking Italian, and it's definitely like appreciated if you speak a little bit, and people always appreciate that, but it's not required.
Incredible. Yeah, so are you able to like talk a little bit about the dorming? Like, is there security or sort of, how does the dorm sort of compare to like a sort of normal, if you will, RISD dorm kind of experience? I know you saw it
Yeah,
sort of
so
briefly, so.
it's very different from like a regular dorm room that you would have in college. So the building where you're in is this historic, again, just like most buildings in Florence, but it's like this historic building. And so all the RISD students thus far have lived on the same floor, but in that building you also have, Airbnbs, and you have people who actually like live in that building. So it's not just a student dorm. But you have your own like apartment key, and you're responsible for like, closing the doors and, being careful. And then obviously like when you first get there, people might not be used to living in an apartment like this. So we have our staff is like we give a pretty comprehensive orientation, and we really try to drill into students' heads like, lock the door, keep the keys with you. Um Yeah, so it's very different from how the dorms are at RISD. And again, there's also no cafeteria. It's sort of like a much more you know, independent way of living than in a typical dorm setting. But I think that's sort of like also, there's fun to being in a dorm, but there's also fun to being in an apartment in Italy, like, with your classmates, I would say. But
Yeah,
there's a lot
that's
of
a
staff to help, obviously.
yeah, that's a great answer. Um, let's see, there was just one. Oh, okay. How is how independent is the program day to day? And what kind of, I don't know, and maybe this is like a larger question, right? Than
Mhm.
one can sort of really sum up, maybe just from
Mhm.
like one observing one semester. But what kind of students or which students did you find maybe really took advantage of the program and sort of all of the sort of opportunities available to them, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, how independent is it day to day? I would say, well, so for context, the Rizzy studios are 7.5 hours long. So when you have studio that day, it is like a whole day commitment essentially. And you have each studio 3 times a week. And this is, in Florence and at RISD. And then outside of studio, you'll have, your liberal arts classes, which tend to be a little bit shorter, probably like an hour and a half. And outside of that, the time is yours. The hours are a little bit different than the hours that, would be in a RISD building. So RISD the hours a little bit longer, but instead Florence, since it's again an old building and we have to have like a person watching it, it closes, a little bit earlier. So, you definitely spend quite a bit of time like in studio, but what's nice is then at 10 p.m. studio closes and then you are kicked out of the building by like you're kicked out of the building. And then you sort of go around in Florence. During the day, talking about the opportunities that students, took advantage of. Again, as I sort of touched on it earlier, we have like an internship program in Florence. And so I actually think Rizzy, we were really good about, getting involved in internships and local things because basically um, we work sort of like with a provider that, other schools also use as well. And I heard that we're pretty good about using the internships. And so, for example, we've had students working in local art galleries, sort of doing social media and video. We've had students working for the Medici Archive project, which is essentially like archiving all these old like books and papers and letters from the Medici. Um, Other internship, yeah. Or for example, we did Cori la Vita, and Cori la Vita is essentially like this fundraising, charity walk, let's say, for breast cancer, which is like this big event that happens in Florence. And it was completely optional for the students to join. And most students, went for it, paid the 10 euros, got the shirt, and, went on this charity walk, which I was really happy to see most of the students, some students even ran it, which I was even more impressed to hear. So yeah, definitely like there's lots of opportunities to, take advantage of. And I would say if you're looking to study abroad, I feel like, you would want to be the type of person to want to take advantage of these things because I sort of said this earlier, but you don't want to just be like a tourist in Florence for 3 months. You want to get involved and you want to, be involved in these things and take advantage of these things while you're in Florence.
Yeah, that totally makes a lot of sense and maybe kind of like segues nicely into this next question that came up. Which I think also you are probably like one of the best people to answer.
Okay.
What is life like outside of campus? So, like things to eat, where people are buying materials, or even just like getting involved again in things that like students, I know you sort of were just touching on this too, but
Mhm.
like might be involved with, as like normal students, if that makes
Mhm.
sense, like no matter where they are in the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I would say so the experience of being a student in Europe generally is sort of different from the experience of being a student in the US. So when you're in the US, you're sort of like on a campus and the student life is like, there's the clubs and the cafeteria and the, sort of more built-in things that are part of the university. But in Europe, it's a little bit different because you don't have a campus, you don't have, clubs in that way in a lot of schools. And so it's definitely like a much more, you know, independent, but also sort of more like it's like soft launching adulthood, let's say. And so it's less about like, going to, whatever club, but you're sort of experiencing like living in the city and, where the dorms are, again, it's like smack in the center of town. So there's lots of restaurants you can go to, lots of nice neighborhoods. And I know the students definitely found like you know, their spots that they ended up really liking. Some of them it was a restaurant across the street from studio, which was convenient for them. But there's lots and lots of places to, go eat, lots, parks to go to, sites to see. And again, lots of the students also took advantage of like where Florence is. So outside of like class, they went to Cinque Terre, which is like, there's like these beach towns in the coast, or I know students went to like Budapest and Paris and took advantage of like traveling. Or some students just sort of like chilled out and stayed in Florence and really took their time to like, get to know people like in the neighborhood. Yeah.
That's awesome. That sounds so fun and ideal.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's fun, especially where the apartments are. I'm honestly, I really am a little bit jealous of where the
Yeah,
apartments are.
no, me
I
too.
have to
All year
say.
we've been like, oh, I wish we could like go visit and like see
No,
all
I
these
know. I'm like, let's
things.
get like a staff dorm going. Like,
Yeah. I think this is something that's no one has asked, but it's something that I
Mhm.
am really curious in, and so I might sort of put, since we have the time, put
Yeah,
my own
yeah.
question in here.
No,
What
definitely.
I think is interesting to me about the first year in Florence program is that the sort of education is set up differently than it is in Providence, right? Where in EFS in Providence, you're taking all three of those studio courses all at once. So you're taking drawing, design, and spatial dynamics side by side. Where
Mhm.
in Florence, you're taking one sort of after the other in sequence. And so I
Mhm.
was wondering if, and again, because you have the experience of being that first year RISD student doing them sort of side by side, I wonder if like you noticed sort of like
Mhm.
that impacting ways of thinking or ways of making
Mhm.
at all. I don't know if that's something you can even answer, but it's just
Yeah,
something
yeah, yeah,
I'm
no.
genuinely curious
So,
about.
no, definitely. I think, yeah, when you just have the one class to focus on, you can really like throw yourself into every assignment. And I think that's especially what we saw. Again, I keep hyping up the instrument assignment, but even with like design and honestly with maybe we just got lucky with the group of students. No, we didn't get lucky with the group of students because we're all amazing. But um, you know, everyone really like put their all into each assignment. And I think since there was just one studio at a time, they could really, really focus and hone in on the specific thing they were working on, especially again with the instrument, because it is sort of like a really time consuming and like labor intensive project that when you're doing it in tandem with two other studios, it's you still have to juggle the other classes. Whereas for this, again, you're sort of like honing in. But having said that, there is something nice about taking all three at the same time because a lot of times there's like a synergy, let's say, between the three studios, and like you get to be like inspired from what you're learning in each studio, and it sort of impacts the work as you're making it in each studio. Um, Whereas this one, it was sort of like building on to what they learned, which I think also made a lot of sense with the order we had the classes because we had drawing and then design and then spatial as like the
Mhm.
last thing, which I think made honestly like so much sense. Um, so yeah, I would just say it really allows you to like really throw yourself into the projects and really like dedicate yourself to like each thing that you're making, which is really nice.
Yeah, that makes sense and almost kind of like warms you up too to like maybe
Yeah,
like
yeah.
risky thinking where like drawing is sort of a little bit more accessible and then kind of
No,
at the
definitely.
end spatial dynamics is always a little bit like, well, what's happening to a
No,
degree?
really, and it's like the one that people are tend to be like less familiar with. But what's
Yes,
nice as
yeah.
well is that like as sort of time goes on when you're in Florence, so when you have your first projects, you're thinking about or specific to Florence, you're like it's your first intro to Florence. And it's like your first reaction to things in Florence. You're making things about the Duomo or about the David or, Botticelli. But then as you go on in the course, you sort of start to find the things that you're more specifically interested in the city. And so already by design, we had students that were doing like rubbings of, like sewer grates or like the manhole covers, I should say it's a better word to use, or, making things about the sound of the bells in Florence or, their favorite, spots to go to in Florence. And so as the time goes on, the interests become sort of more specific. And I don't know, it's as someone from Florence, that's nice to see because I mean, yeah, I get to see my city through other people's eyes, and it's sort of really like nice to see what everyone's takeaway is and how the takeaways sort of like change as time goes on and as the courses sort of like progress.
Right. Yeah. And as they get kind of more like lived experience
Mhm,
too, which is
mhm,
really sweet. A little bit more like intimacy or something like that.
mhm.
This next question is one that I certainly can't answer because I don't live in Italy, and only sort of am from the United States. And so
Mhm.
it might be like a little bit more of a specific question, but I'm going to
Yeah.
pose it, right, just because I've got you here basically. And so if you
Yeah.
can't answer it too, like no sweat. But this one person is asking about sort of like safety and tolerance for those specifically of the LGBTQ plus
Mhm.
community in Italy or in Florence in particular. Um, so I just was wondering if it's something you could talk about, maybe if you're aware of like those kinds of environments in
Yeah.
Florence and what that sort of looks and feels like.
Yeah, so, I've been saying this whole time how nice it is to be, oh, it's in the center of Florence, it's in the center of Florence, but you still are in the center of a city. And so with that, some things do come up where it's like, just the sort of realities of city living. So Florence isn't, it's sort of like a medium city, but it does have some big city things. So, in Europe, sort of common thing is like pickpocketing, it can happen sometimes, or sort of that kind of safety stuff does happen. We try to do our best to like help people be aware of how to like, not fall victim to those kinds of things. And, we're pretty good, knock on wood, this past semester. Um, so I would say there's like definitely a little bit of that. So as long as you, but I would say for Florence, as long as you have like your head on your shoulders and you're not sort of like going out like on your own, then generally, again, knock on wood, you should be okay. Specific to like, queer rights, it is mostly, yeah, it's Florence in terms of like Italy is like a pretty tolerant place. So generally it's yeah, it's okay. There's even like some, queer specific spaces in Florence. It's definitely not the same as if you were like at RISD where that's sort of like, RISD and Providence where we're like sort of like in the bubble of like RISD and Brown. It's, not that. But I would say like you don't really have to worry about like, yeah, you don't have to worry about it that much. Again, still, you are in a city, so some things can come up, but it's not like a place where you have to like hide it.
Yes, that makes sense. And I think is a
Again,
great
knock on
sort
wood.
of
Yeah.
point too, right? Like just like university life is different, and where here on campus you're in that sort of in Providence, kind of that little bit of that bubble where a lot of things around you are sort of all about university, but right, and somewhere like Florence, you might be more integrated into the city, and so getting a little
Yeah.
bit more of that like adult, if you will, kind of living experience to it, and sort of what that means and sort of looks like too.
Yeah, and I mean, Italy has just had, I mean, not just specific to queer rights. It's just like we've had a different history than the US. So, you might find some sort of like cultural differences that might be a little bit like jarring. And it doesn't always necessarily come from like a malicious place. It's just, we're sort of still catching up to some of the things that, the US has been knowing for a while.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and sort of perspective to have too. Um, this is a question I'm not sure if you are aware of. It's
Hmm.
something I can certainly sort of lead somewhere else to, sort of point in the direction to, if not.
Yeah.
But were you aware of students kind of checking in at RISD first and then flying to Florence together? Or is everyone kind of coming from their own sort of places and then joining up in Florence?
So for the fall semester, you start, I think it's the same as a normal RISD student. So you wouldn't really ever like, yeah, you wouldn't check in at RISD, then fly out of Boston to go to Florence. I think, some students, we had quite a few students from like the Bay Area, for example. So, some people flew together from the Bay to Florence. So specific to fall, no one really went to like RISD first and then to Florence. If you know people that are like near you, then, some people sort of like coordinated and went over. And yeah, some people find each other through like the accounts like RISD 2030, I think we're at now. Ooh. RISD 2030, and then they're like, oh, I'm going to Florence, and sort of make your community that way. Then I'm sure for the spring students, a lot of the spring students have already met each other. I think they live in like the same floor of their dorm currently. So they already know each other. So I think it'll be a little bit different for them. But yeah, for fall, I think yeah, you're sort of coming into it maybe knowing people from like meeting on Instagram and talking on DMs, but everyone is sort of meeting each other for the first time for the most part.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Like, right, sort of normally you'd be kind of just all coming to a campus all at once. And right, you can certainly sort of chat with people beforehand. And I know we kind of asked this question maybe in a little bit of a different way, but maybe just kind of again reiterating what kind of student really was sort of thriving in the Florence program and sort of maybe, yeah, what kind of outcomes or something like that one can find here.
I would say definitely people who are flexible is good.
Hmm.
People who, yeah, I don't necessarily think you need to be like independent. I don't think that's like a requirement, but I think you need to be open-minded. And, again, like if you don't know how to cook, you have to be willing to learn how to cook. And if you're not, if you're going to Italy, you have to be willing to learn a new language and to really be prepared to like have this new experience. Especially, sort of second semester students will have had that first semester of like meeting other people in that first, college semester. But especially if you're coming in for the fall, where it's also your first, time in college, definitely someone who, again, is flexible, is open-minded, is, um, willing to try new things. I feel like these are like sort of like generic like buzzwords, but it's sort of like is the is sort of like the truth of it. Because to sort of take on an experience like this, you definitely have to be ready to, you know, be like, okay, today we're going to Cremona and we're looking at violins. It's like, yes, I will get on that train and we will go. And, or, whenever we're meeting to go to museums, you have to be able to be like, okay, I will be at the meeting point at this time. Like, I'll be here, I'll be there, I will have my things. So a few people who are sort of like have also heads on their shoulders, I would say. And just, last word probably be just like, I don't know, curiosity, just curiosity of like seeing what's in Florence, taking advantage of the opportunities we have, and really being able to like, throw yourself into the projects and being willing to like take on this experience.
Yeah, I think that makes, and something I'm thinking about too is like, right, like being willing to really immerse yourself somewhere and like take in the influences of a different place where you might be doing that, right, on a college campus that's new to you in the United States. But I do feel a little bit like the first year experience in Providence might be a little bit more about like sort of discovering yourself. And obviously that's happening no matter what and no matter
Yeah, yeah.
where you are. But there is a little bit more of that sort of perspective shift of being yourself in a different country, and so being
Yeah.
willing to sort of take on those kind of cultural differences and sort of influences there too. I think is just something to be able to take advantage of, really, and whether or not you're sort of really diving into that really deeply is certainly, there's a value scale there where there's differences. But yeah, just being willing to kind of get involved with that too. Um, and I know with us before, right, with me and Marin, you were kind of just talking about the schedule of things. So we've got our sort of spring cohort kind of coming in quickly next week. This one person is asking about the sort of days off in between the fall and spring semester, and whether or not there's sort of some breathing room in there, right, to kind of discover other places and maybe go a little bit around Europe. So maybe talking a little bit about what that sort of schedule looks like, whether or not
Mhm.
it's a fall Florence student returning to Providence or a Providence student going off to Florence.
So, you definitely have time to sort of explore, other cities and other parts of Italy while you're a student here. Unfortunately, once sort of the semester ends, you can't, stay in the dorms indefinitely. But we definitely had students, who their family have come either to drop them off or to pick them up, and like, they've then gone on their little, family fun time around Europe. But then, yeah, so the studio or the semester for fall ended, I think December 13th, same as RISD. And then there's what, 2 or 3 weeks before winter session starts, I think. And so since you're a first year student, you are required to take, winter session. So you have to be back on campus for that. I guess the time between then is sort of like up to you. But unfortunately, yeah, once the semester ends, you have to like, check out of your dorm. But that's, same as if you're at RISD, you can't stay, or, depends on the situation. But, at a certain point, you have to, you know, go back. But yeah, during the semester, there's also times where there's, long weekends, some bank holidays, that you get to sort of like, take advantage of those and go on some slightly like longer trips. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's important to keep in mind too that, right, like as a first year student, even on our campus, like there's not too much. time in between that first fall semester and then the sort of winter session. And so
Yeah.
just sort of keeping in mind too that this is your first year on campus, and so it is really about sort of learning and sort of adjusting to sort of university kind of life, if that makes sense.
And then maybe something that might be worth mentioning too is that, when you're in Florence, you're still like getting you're still learning about how things are at RISD. It's not like you're like in Florence and then we just throw you back to Providence and then that's that. So when you go back to Providence, you have a little orientation. I'm thinking specifically of fall because, spring students have seen it already, but for fall students, we've sort of tried to also do like programming throughout the semester to be like, okay, like here's how, here's what you can do in RISD and Providence. Here are the clubs. Here's, things at Brown, like that kind of stuff. And so we like try to give you like, some type of like, an idea of what things are like at RISD so that you're not completely just like, you know, thrown to the wolves, so to speak. So yeah, we try, yeah. And then when you're back on campus, you get an orientation. Then you, again, also get an orientation like when you're in Florence as well. But that's just something that might be worth mentioning.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's been a few questions too that I'll sort of just answer, like
Mm.
about when you know if you're like, how do you know if you're admitted to the Florence program? You receive that um, notification or sort of that decision alongside your regular kind of admissions decisions to RISD. So when we send out our sort of admission letters, you'll receive that answer alongside your sort of again admission decision. So it'll say like you've been admitted to RISD and you are admitted for fall Florence or spring Florence or something like that. So it's alongside your normal decision letter. So there's no kind of separate admission decision process, if that makes sense. And this person asked if instrument making is a big part of this program experience. So maybe just clarifying the kind of weight or
Mm.
the intention too behind that instrument making, because I know instrument
Yeah, yeah.
making is like a very specific
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah. So I've
practice,
been,
and
yeah,
so
yeah.
it's not necessarily like we are an instrument making
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
school.
Sorry. I've been talking a lot about like the instrument, but the instrument happened because of the faculty that came here. So, we have a different set of faculty coming in spring, so the assignments will be completely different, and that's how it is also at RISD. So sometimes you'll get, the instrument professor, the animation professor, whatever. I think there's some assignments that are sort of like, well known, and the instrument happens to be one of them. But sort of the way of the course, I mean, there's sort of like a general through line, I would say, about, what you'll learn in design, what you'll learn in drawing, and what you'll learn in spatial. But, whether it's an instrument or a chair or, something completely different is up to the faculty. So again, since we're having different faculty in the spring students will not be making instruments, unfortunately, because I thought it was a really cool assignment. But yeah, I've been talking about instruments a lot because it's like it was unique and it was fun and the trip we went on was fun, but it's not like, EFS Florence is the instrument making program. Like it just so happened to be that way.
Yes, and I do feel like the sort of EFS instrument project with Rachel is kind of like an iconic one. I
Yeah.
think she does a really great job with that class. So I think it's also, I feel like we mention it here and other places because it's pretty exciting. It's a kind of unique opportunity to kind of get involved with.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily want to like put this entirety like sort of like cultural weight of like Italy on you just because you're kind of our resident Italian here. But I do think it is maybe important for folks to kind of determine whether or not they're super like interested in this program. We were talking about sort of LGBTQ plus kind of um, I don't know, acceptance in Italy and Florence. And maybe you could sort of touch similarly on kind of racial views or attitudes as well. I do think it's again
Mhm.
important to note that, right, there are very different histories and sort
Yeah.
of contexts that both countries have, and especially Europe, it's like can be slightly different. But maybe just touching a little
Mm.
bit on that if you feel comfortable, you certainly
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't want you to be you're not the face of Italy for sure
No,
too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's definitely, like I said, it's just different from the US. I think it's in the center of Florence, it's, better because there's lots of tourists, so you see a lot of different faces. So it's not like you're studying in like, some small town, where they don't see people that aren't just like white people. But, you know, again, it's still not the US. So it's definitely like a little bit less diverse, and there might be some things people, I don't know, there's some things that we need to like catch up on, like I've said, culturally. um yeah, it's just different. Trying to think of like a good way to explain it. Yeah, it's just sort of like different a little bit. Yeah, it's just very different from the US, and we've had different histories as countries. And again, I think we are getting better with it. Again, with tourism, we've seen like a lot of people coming through our city, so especially like in the center, we're used to it. But unfortunately, because I don't want to sugarcoat things, like some things do happen sometimes. I mean, it's thankfully nothing happened to like any of our students, but that's also the realities of like being in a city, that you'll have some people that maybe have some views that you might not agree with. So it can happen. It can happen. It's not like, I don't want to, paint an untrue picture, but that's sort of just like the reality also of being in a city, I would say.
Yeah, and I certainly think too, like maybe like doing, folks doing their own research, right? Because these are kind of like not necessarily anecdotal, but
Mm.
um, yeah, I think it's just important to understand the kind of history of places too. And you mentioned a little bit about the like a professor from a different art school coming in to kind of teach frescoes.
Mm.
Is there like a larger partnership with a local school,
Mm.
or is that kind of like a one-off thing?
Yeah. So basically, the program that we do is RISD in Florence, and so we have the RISD professors come in and the RISD students come in, and the studio space is like the RISD studio space. But RISD does not like own the building. It's sort of done through a partner organization called Accent Global. And Accent Global is also the people that do like the housing and the travel logistics and organize the trips for the faculty. And it's the people who also you'll see sort of like on a daily basis. And so it's not just Rizzi that is with Accent Global. So Accent Global also has programs with U Chicago, Michigan, the UCs, yeah, and a bunch of other universities. So there's other, yeah. So like for example, one of the first events that happens early in the semester is like our sort of like career internship fair. And so there you'll get to see some of the other students. Um, yeah, so it's not just Rizzi. It's done through this partner organization, which is also how we have like, the art history professors, for example, or the guests that come in for, critiques or even just like special workshops. So yeah, it is done through like a partner organization.
Yes, definitely. Yes, it is called Accent Global. Someone just asked that question.
Yeah, Accent Global.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And they work with schools, their kind of business is working with universities to kind of set up
Yeah,
programs
we're
like
a
this.
provider for study abroad, and
Yes.
we have like Florence, Rome, London, like a bunch of different cities. But yeah.
Yes, definitely. And I also want to mention too that like this question that just came in, if you get accepted to the program, but you change your mind and you want to stay on campus, you certainly can decline. We're not going to force you to go to Florence. You can't just like, but you can't like necessarily decline and say, I want to go for this next semester. So you are admitted
Mhm.
for the specific semester that we kind of list in that kind of decision, but you certainly don't have to attend for sure. Let's see. Are the liberal arts classes like including students from other schools, from other
That
universities?
no, I think it's just RISD,
Right.
because I think the class that they take is THAD, which is Theory and History and Art of Design,
Right.
like for RISD, which is like the first year RISD art history class. So it's just the RISD students.
Yes, yeah, because they're like again like tailoring these programs
Yeah, it's like
specifically.
the
Yeah.
course is tailored
Yeah.
for RISD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if anyone has any other questions, please. Okay, are there any fashion studios that students can try? I do want to again sort of point out that this is for our EFS program. So if you want to kind of try out that sort of apparel department on our campus, you can do that during our like winter session. But all of the courses offered in EFS, no matter if you're Providence or Florence based, are those design, spatial dynamics, and drawing studios. So no major kind of focus studios in the first year. All right, we'll give it a couple of moments just for any other last minute questions to come in because we are a little bit before the time here. But if not, again, I want to thank you all for kind of tuning in with us today. I hope you learned a little bit about our program here. We're excited to kind of kick off the spring semester soon and sort of see kind of what it's like for Providence students to come and see you all in Florence. We are recording this webinar and we will post it on our RISD YouTube channel where we post all of our recordings of our webinars. So if there's something that we've done in the past that you want to check out, you can find all of that there. We should be posting this one up in a handful of days. Um, and again, we've gotten this question too, so maybe I'll just kind of say this as well. Brown RISD dual degree students, unfortunately, aren't able to take part in the sort of first year in Florence program, since you are on kind of that specific first year track with us. I'm not sure if that means you can't study abroad ever. I'm sure there's opportunities to, but just for the first year program for the Florence, it is unavailable to our dual degree students.
Yeah. And I would still, of course, just to I'm trying to remember real quick, absolutely right. But because seeing as when you're applying to dual degree, if you're interested in Florence, still indicate that on your RISD Common App. Because if you don't end up doing dual degree, but you end up at RISD, then you can still be considered for the first year in Florence program. But yes,
Yeah.
if you're in dual degree, as LJ said, you're already in two places at once because you're at Brown and RISD. So yeah. But okay, this has been amazing. I just have to say, I've been in here diligently answering questions, and I do just want to remind everyone, like, there will be more. There's some great questions that came in specific to, financial aid and visa and all stuff and all of those logistics. As LJ mentioned at the top of this presentation, that will be covered in future webinars, specifically for students who are going to Florence, and you'll have all of that, those resources and assistance, all that information. I just want to say, like, this has been so incredible, and I'll hand it to you both to close this out. But I just personally want to say thank you so, so much, Matteo. You're incredible. You're wonderful, and thank you, LJ. Incredible, like just incredible conversation about this program. I'm really, really excited. Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you too. And again, if anything else comes up for anybody, please never hesitate to reach out to us. I know, applying to school or sort of deciding on schools is a big decision, but then also kind of deciding that study abroad factor too is also a really large decision. And so we're really here to help kind of weigh your options and figure out if this is something that looks or feels exciting to you and would be a good decision to kind of make in that kind of first year as well. And again, yeah, thank you so much, Mateo. It's been really great to kind of hear about your experience and sort of what you guys have been up to. I certainly wish I could join you and sort of be on the other side of this webinar,
Me
but
too.
I'll live through you instead.
Anytime, guys. When you're in town, just let me know.
Will do.
Okay. No, thank you for having me. And to those of you watching, if you do end up coming to Florence, remember my face. Hopefully you'll be seeing me. Yeah.
Yay, awesome.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll sign off here. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days and nights, et cetera, et cetera. And never hesitate to reach out to us for sure. All right, everyone. Thank you so much.